Hello, hello, hello. I hope you can hear me. We are trying some new streaming technology tonight, so God bless us all. I have two guests that will be joining me shortly, but hello and welcome to the Digital Orthodontist Live. This is the only, and it's the first live podcast for orthodontists. I'm your host, Dr. Kyle Fagala, and tonight we're going to be debating the financials of selling your practice to an OSO versus that of holding your private practice. So, what is going to be the better short-term and the better long-term option for your pocketbook and for your practice? It's a very popular question these days, no doubt, and we're here to address it head on. So I'll be joined by Dr. Glenn Krieger and Dr. Aaron Swapp. They recently had some back and forth, as it were, on the Facebook groups about their spreadsheets or their financial calculators and how they evaluate these differences between options. And so I've asked them tonight to join me so we can discuss these numbers together. We're going to look at different scenarios, different milestones, 5, 10, 15-year marks. We're also going to cover the pitfalls in evaluating offers from an OSO, maybe how to view your practice as a long-term investment, whichever direction you go in. And then also we're going to look at the advantages of the new joint venture model over the traditional 100% sale option. As always, our audience is extremely important. And I'm noticing that the comments, normally they come in through the software, they're not. And so that's a bummer. And so what I'm going to do is I'll be checking the chat every so often, and we're going to see if there's any questions there. And if there's any good questions, we'll definitely ask those here on the broadcast. Keep your questions and your comments respectful. We're professionals here, but it is important that you're a part of this conversation. So before we get into the conversation, I do have a quick message from tonight's episode sponsor, that is Ortho. I'm sure you all know Ortho, and I'm sure you all know that nationwide, the averages this year are down. Orthodontic production is down, not for everyone, but as an average. And what are the challenges that our industry is facing, and what can we do to combat those changes? Ortho has put together an ebook. It discusses 3 different powerful strategies to sustain growth when there is a softer consumer demand. And so they're offering a brand new 14-page ebook on this exact topic, how to grow during a season of softer consumer demand. I have read the ebook. It's excellent. It is worth your time to download and read it. You can go receive it for free if you'll visit startmoresmiles.com/ebook, startmoresmiles.com/ebook, or if you know someone at Ortho, say, hey, send me that ebook, would you? It's very good. So go check that out. And thanks again to Ortho for sponsoring this and making this possible. So let's bring on our guests. We have Dr. Swapp. We have Dr. Krieger. You are such handsome gentlemen. Thanks for being here. How are you guys?
Doing good.
Doing great. Thanks for having us.
Great. Wonderful. Glad to have you here. We have a pretty sizable audience on Facebook. On our screen, it's showing that 8 people are watching. It's more than that. It's something like 80 something. So I don't know what's going on. We'll get it sorted out by the next time. As long as you can see and hear us, we're going to be okay. And hopefully it's recording in some fashion. So let me read some bios. I know bios are kind of clunky, but I found that when I don't read them, people don't like it. So let me read that. So Dr. Glenn Krieger, these are not submitted bios. These are things that I found online and actually had ChatGPT help me with. But he is a highly respected orthodontist, educator, and speaker with over 3 decades of experience in the dental field and in the orthodontic field. I guess, we're pushing 10 years now, huh?
Yeah, December.
Yeah. Fantastic. He's a founder of Orthopreneurs. It's a platform dedicated to helping orthodontists grow their practice and thrive in their careers. And Dr. Krieger also supports veterans through the Embracing Our Warriors program, which provides free ortho care to veterans and their families, which helps them reintegrate into civilian life with confidence. Dr. Aaron Swapp is a highly accomplished orthodontist who graduated summa cum laude from UNLV Dental. He earned his master's degree in ortho certificate from Baylor, which is in Dallas, which is funny. We have an admittedly Dallas Metro night tonight. Yeah. But anyway, he's published multiple research articles. And outside of those accomplishments, he likes to restore old cars. He likes to hike, camp, and he's actively involved in his community and his church. So Dr. Glenn, Dr. Aaron, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you, Kyle. Glad to be here.
I'm excited to have you guys here. I'm going to do a little soft clap just to get us in the mood for tonight. And let's, now that that's all, just one clap would be enough.
They really like this.
It liked you enough to clap for you twice. No, it's just set to loop. Just all kinds of just comedies of errors. When you're doing something live, you just never know what you're going to get. So let's start, go right into the belly of the beast as we talk about these things. We're going to talk conflicts of interest because turns out no matter what topic you talk about, pretty much there's going to be some conflicts of interest. We are talking about financial considerations. So go figure. There's some conflicts of interest. So let's get those out of the way. So we'll start with Glenn. Glenn, correct me where I'm wrong, but you sold your practice, partnered with Smile Doctors a few years ago.
Yeah.
2022?
2021.
2021.
Yeah, coming up on 3 years.
And you're a friend of mine. You have thick skin, so I think anything I get into, you can handle. But I just want to say this, and not in a critical way, but you are seen as one of the most pro-OSO voices in orthodontics. I think in fairness, you talk about a lot of stuff online, and you're going to, there's no conversation that you're not willing to dive into. I think I would say that. I think that's safe to say. But you do, I think because of that, take a lot of criticism specific to this topic. So what would you say to those who are critical of your positions on OSOs?
It's funny because, first of all, thanks for having me tonight. I always love being on your show. You're the Jimmy Fallon of Ortho.
I hate when you say that so much.
I love it. It's so true. You got the games, you got the cards, the jacket. I mean, but, it's, I think for people who don't know me, which is the overwhelming majority of the people who are out there, they may know some of the things I write, some of the things I post. I am not pro-OSO, all right? That's like one of the fallacies out there. I'm pro-OSO discussion. I'm very, very in favor of not shutting down the discussion because having had legitimately 200 to 300 one-on-one conversations with doctors over the last 3 to 4 years, I'm yet to meet the orthodontist who didn't learn something significant during our conversation that they didn't know earlier that could very well shape the conversation. So that's what I'm really pro. Because as I tell, this about me, Kyle, and I tell this to a lot of folks, I like being an orthodontist. It's great. It's fun. It's transactional to me. People pay me to fix a smile. I fix it with a smile on my face, happily to the best of my ability. Helping my peers and why I do orthopreneurs is my A+. So when people talk about, I get such satisfaction when I fix a smile, imagine that's how I feel when I sit with somebody who's thinking or not thinking about an OSO and they walk away more educated because I feel good about that. Now, there is conflict of interest there, and we need to talk about that because most OSOs, if someone brings someone into the fold, so to speak, there's a finder's fee. Beyond that, I have another conflict of interest. If I have someone say like Aaron, who I don't mean to embarrass you, Aaron, but he's killing it. He's an amazing orthodontist with an amazing practice. I want him to be my partner. Now, that doesn't mean I'm going to lie to him because imagine what happens if I lie to Aaron, get him into Smile Doctors as my partner, and then a year or two later, it's a bad choice that I talked him into and I was duplicitous. What's going to happen? He's going to come to me. I can't escape it. He's going to be all over me going, Glenn, why'd you talk me into this? And so to date, I would say probably maybe of the, let's call it 250 conversations I've had one-on-one, maybe 30% were people I tried to talk to and said, you'd be a good fit. Would you consider it? And it was no different with Aaron when I spoke to him. But that being said, I'd say a large percentage of the people I talk to are practicing in states where Smile Doctors doesn't even practice. And there's a lot of people who may be listening tonight who I did a one-on-one with where I recommended them to other OSOs, where I said, they don't operate in this state, but let me make an introduction to you for somebody at this OSO. And I don't get any kickback for that. We do these things the same way we treat our patients to the best of our ability because it's what we do. We treat our peers well and try to take care of each other. And unfortunately, to many out there, that altruism is not how they operate. So to them, to many of them, why would anybody want to do this unless they're getting something? And again, for anybody who's spoken to me one-on-one, you'll see there's no pressure whatsoever. So sorry for the long answer there, Kyle. But I know that's probably one of the biggest arrows fired at me, which I'm okay with. And remember this, people, this is important. When you run a major group, every now and then, it's good to post something just to wrangle some feathers a little bit. All right. And Kyle knows what I'm talking about. And I like to stir the pot every now and then. So again, I love to see the conversations. And every now and then, I'm going to stir it up a little bit.
Fair enough. I like it. Well, and I think ultimately people are either going to believe you and take it your word or not, and
Yeah,
that's only so controllable. So ultimately, we are the masters of our own domain. We can make the decisions we want to make.
exactly.
I think the goal of tonight is to try to have as objective and intellectually honest a conversation as we can
Agree.
about the numbers, because math is a universal language, and I think what we'll find later is that you can only be so exacting with a financial calculator. It's only so one size fits all. But we're going to do our best to sort of lay this out there and say, hey, here's what we think, and we're trying to be very reasonable about it. There are some videos that float around where I think people try to stack the deck too far one direction or the other, and my BS meter goes off. And so hopefully we'll not have BS meters going off tonight with the calculators we discussed. But hey, you never know. My BS meter is not your BS meter, and so on. All right. So, Aaron, I want to come to you now. You have probably not as well known a bias, but you do have a bias. First, you own a private practice. So I think inherently you're a little biased. Now, in fairness, Glenn used to own a private practice, and whatever. So I own a private practice, so I'm trying to be a moderate voice tonight, but I guess, clearly I'm a little bit biased. But you also have a sort of co-op that you're starting, and I want you to tell us about that. Aaron has not asked me to speak about this. It's just I want to get this stuff out of the way so that you kind of know who you're listening to tonight. I think that's fair. But tell us about that, and then, tell us why that doesn't necessarily make the way you've approached this a biased process. So if you don't mind.
Oh yeah, and I'm glad you brought this up because I thought I wouldn't mention it just because I didn't want it to be any self promotion. But when I started out as kind of deciding to be an orthodontist, the part that excited me most was being my own boss, and it's been great, and I've loved it. And when the DSO scene kind of the DSOs came on the scene, and I really wanted to look at it because despite loving private practice and entrepreneurship so much, I also love my family. And if there's a situation where I could create generational wealth, which was the term I heard throwing around, that I think I should look into it. And so I kind of made this calculator that we're going to discuss. But when I looked at it and saw that, at least for what I could tell, for the majority of orthodontists, that financially it was no better, and in many cases worse, in my opinion, that that kind of made it easier. And so my next step was, okay, so how can we get all of the benefits and really find a way as more of a co-op, like you said, to be able to get some of those benefits that the DSOs get, and essentially not have to give up anything. I'm the type of guy that I just want it all. And so I wanted to create something that would give it all to us. And so P3 Ortho is the name of it. Stands for Private Practice Partners. And if any of you have had to try to think of a name, it's really hard. So that's basically what I came up with. But it's essentially a co-op, and I would say right now the status it's at is essentially a nonprofit type of organization. Although once we get to a certain threshold of about 50 doctors, we're about halfway there now. It really opens the doors to a lot of opportunities, and there may be a charge to cover some of the expenses that's a little bit more, just to make sure that it can sustain itself. But the goal is to make it very mutually beneficial and not to really favor any one person. So that's kind of where we are with that.
All right. So you're massively biased. Okay. Now I understand.
Yeah, right. Exactly. I'm pretty strongly biased towards private practice, but again, if there's a deal that really makes sense, then, I want in on that.
Yeah, right on. Okay. And I think not to sort of spoil things, but I think there's scenarios where we both agree it probably makes sense to sell, and scenarios where it doesn't. And I think there's going to be a little bit of that sort of, I call it ecumenical conversation to come. So one of my favorite 50 Cent words, not 50 Cent the rapper, just 50 Cent in terms of value. I'm going to keep going. So let's get into the financial calculators if we can. The reason we're doing this, as I alluded to, was you guys had a little bit of a conversation about your calculators, and maybe they differed, but it seemed like there was a sort of like meeting of the mind and a little mutual respect summit, as it were, about your calculators and so on. And, that was great to see, I think. So I was like, hey, let's do a podcast. Why not? And so, again, we're going to look at sort of the metrics on selling to private practice, or sorry, selling to an OSO or keeping your practice. And so we don't want to paint with too broad of a brush tonight. But I do think that this is a helpful way to have this conversation. So we're actually going to start. Glenn, I think Glenn, knowing Glenn and knowing himself, he doesn't want to talk for 15 minutes about his financial calculator. So he actually made a 4-minute video, which I thought was a beautiful olive branch of sorts to our audience. And he does an excellent job summarizing his calculator. So I'm going to turn the mic over to Glenn from, what was this, 22 hours ago or something, you know? And then we're going to see what he has to say about his financial calculator. So let's see how this goes. Here we go.
Folks, this is a 30,000 foot view of the calculator I have, which you will never download because I realize there's too many people using it for the wrong reasons. But I will go over this one-on-one with you if you're looking to think about an OSO. I've done this with a couple of hundred people at least. The overwhelming majority of them are not in states where Smile Doctors operates. So if you're concerned about, me trying to do something on your back, so to speak, you have nothing to worry about. I have literally dozens, if not hundreds of people who can attest to the fact there's no pressure when we go through this, but I'm not getting this out into public. Again, too many nefarious actors or too many people trying to use it for the wrong reasons. Now, remember, this is not accurate. Okay, this is all for entertainment. This is as accurate as you putting your arm into a blood pressure cuff at CVS outside the pharmacy. It is a baseball bat, not a scalpel. So don't take this as gospel. There are many reasons why you should join an OSO or not join an OSO, but the money's one of them. And again, there's a great conversation to be had. Now, you start at the Start Here tab down at the bottom, and one should pay attention to the fact that all of this is like the very, 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 very basics of PE-backed models that you have to get started with before you even go into the calculator. Because there's so much that you just don't know about private equity. And I dove into this for 3 full years now. And there has not yet been one person I've ever gone through with this who didn't say, when I was done going through the first 30 to 45 minutes of just explaining it, who didn't say, wow, I had no idea. Why do people say this? And I say, because they've got an axe to grind. I'm neither pro nor anti-OSO. I am pro my peers making educated decisions, and that is it. So anybody who's ever been on the phone with me or been Zoom with me will tell you, I don't ever pressure anybody to join anything, but I do pressure you to make an informed decision, because this is the most important financial decision you'll ever make in your practice life. And all too often, you're being swayed by people who are giving you bad information. So you start with the Start Here. You have 3 options: the no sale and maintain, the 100% partnership where they buy everything, or the partial sale. The partial sale is something that the only American OSO that I know of that does partial sale is Smile Doctors. 100% partnership is common. You'll see people buy 100% of the practice in exchange for the money. But the partial sale means you get a percentage of the practice, so you maintain profitability. There's a whole series of reasons why it's really nice for you and for the private equity-backed company, but it's obviously more complicated. And let's look at the numbers. No matter what happens, you're going to do better than 99.9% of people on the globe. Money is just one component of all of this, all right? And again, this is all, in many respects, a joke. Why? Because what's your tax rate? Do you know exactly what your functional tax is after you take everything into account? Do you know what your take-home profit is going to be for year 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9? It's all conjecture. Or how much you're going to put aside in the profit. So the sale of your practice, and there's a whole series of things on here that every one of these things comes from education and understanding. What are we talking about in terms of terms? Why 4 years? Why a 2x multiple? Why do we have to wait 5 years for a 2.5? Right? Are any of these numbers bizarre or weird or strange? No. How did we get to our total value of our deal? So all of these are things that someone has to walk you through. And again, 100% transparency. If you join Smile Doctors and I go with you, I may or may not get some sort of finder's fee, like many of the OSO DSOs do. I don't get anything from anybody else. But at the same time, I don't care if you're joining Smile Doctors or not. If you want to sit down and go through this, I will gladly go through this with you. But understand, chances are you don't know enough to make a good decision until someone explains everything. And there are things like private equity life cycle and other stuff that you need to know. So I hope this helps. I'm sorry it took us about 4 minutes.
Oh, it was very nicely done. Thank you, Glenn from 22 hours ago, whatever it was. Past Glenn. Okay, so I think what I'll do, just in the interest of time, is Aaron, you go ahead and do, I hope it's a 4-minute spiel on your side. It's only fair. And
it's only fair.
Yeah, something in
this
that.
This is an exhibition, not a competition.
Right. Yeah, indeed. And so I think I'm working the slides for you now, and I feel like I'm a 10th grader at Southwest Church of Christ working the slides for our Wednesday night worship. So working the slides, it was a little bit of a deep cut there. But go ahead, pick
You
up
know,
with your.
it's pretty much the same thing, and it's probably what you think. You have a set of variables, you punch them in, and it spits out kind of what you estimate being the value of your different options. Now, maybe somewhat contrary to Glenn, I actually think these are very, very useful tools in making decisions. Not that the amount that it shows is going to be the exact amount that's be in your bank account, so many years from now, but I think it's a good comparison tool. So you can't predict everything, but a lot of the factors that are going to affect your private practice are also going to affect your ownership in a DSO to some degree. And so I like them because at least gives you something, some sort of objective measure of what you're looking at. So some of the big, I guess, factors that you should look at, variables, obviously profitability, that goes for both scenarios. That's what really determines your EBITDA. If you're looking at it from a point of selling, I guess, how long do you plan on working in this situation? So, or in that, one of the two, and then how much ownership are you going to retain, and the multiple you're going to receive. All of those are really important factors, but this happens to include more. It includes living expenses. Like I said, your retained ownership. It calculates the taxes based off of your, I guess, your tax bracket, but it really averages it out so that it accounts for, the first part that's not necessarily taxed at your peak amount. I think it's a really accurate calculator. So this is essentially what it goes to. All those numbers, you punch them in, and it goes, and this is what does the calculations on the next tab. So this is actually available, and you can go in and try it out and look at it on that last slide. You don't have to go back to it, but there's little comments. If you see those little pink boxes in the corner or little pink triangles, that gives you the information you need. So just to go through it really quickly, and I don't know, do I go in and kind of show these different examples? Because that kind of goes over the calculator, but.
Yeah, sure. If you think so.
Yeah.
I
I
think
can go through and show you what, just some examples of how this works. So this is the front page. I have my disclaimers or the calculator limitations in that top right corner. So those are the things it doesn't calculate. But if you take a practice, let's say what I would consider an average practice of $2 million, and you have 55% overhead, and you estimate an EBITDA of 550,000. In this particular case, since it's a 100% sell, and I've always allotted maybe a little lower multiple for a 100% sell, and I'm sure there are examples of that differ from that. But of 6, you have your stock in the company of 10%, and then that next line, that's where if it's a graduated payout. So if you get 60% of your payout at year 0 at closing, and then 2 years later you get 30 and 10, you can kind of specify what or how that will be planned out. Your salary after, your living expenses, and I'm going to talk, the living expenses is an important part because the calculations that I present on the right there, that's the living expenses removed. So it's not showing you the full amount that you will receive overall. It's showing you like what is really your wealth accumulation after you've lived and done the things that you normally do. You can put in your ownership amount, years that you will take out that ownership, and that the year you might sell your stock, expected market returns, and so on. So I would say this is the average practice. Maybe a couple of areas where I favored private practice was the purchase price in a traditional sale. I put that at 110%, which I think, given the demand, is a reasonable amount nowadays. I mean, I paid 107%, and this was many years ago. There is a place where you can put write-offs, and depending on what you would consider write-off, I kept mine kind of including, payroll to my family and a few other things. But there are situations where that can be a lot higher when you start including all of the
Sure.
tax benefits you get from the different.
Hey, Aaron, let me ask a question real quick.
Yeah.
Someone in the chat, this is Justin. Oh, never mind. They solved it. Michael Picard solved it for him. He was asking how the EBITDA was 550 on a 2 million practice. Shouldn't it be 900? But it was Dr. Pay came out.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay. So that's the longest part of my little explanation here.
Yeah.
I'll go through it real quick after that. So in
Yeah.
this particular scenario, if you look at year 5, and I have a caveat to these numbers, if it's something, if the traditional number is within 10% of a DSO number, I would consider those equal. So in any of these, if it's about 10% away, I think there's a margin of error there that would make it equal. But you can see at year 5, they're pretty much equal. At year 10 is when it starts to change, because the big thing I want to get across while we talk here is your practice is your best investment. And that return on investment starts to show after year 5. So by year 20, you can see, it's a $8 million difference in this particular scenario.
All right. So then it looks like you got low profitability. And I think you got one that's high profitability. How do those differ then?
Yeah. If you're low profitability, the hard part is you just don't have a lot of money for that multiple to work on. So if you're selling it and you have a multiple of 6, there's just not a lot to go on. And it functions the same with private practice, but it really affects you in that payout because there's just not a lot of room there.
Okay. And then
high profitability is different. And while I would say that's still within that 10% range, you can see at year 5, a DSO will be slightly higher because that EBITDA can work on, that multiple can work on a much larger EBITDA.
Yeah, right on. Okay. So I think that kind of makes sense. Hopefully that sort of gets into some of it. And obviously here's where we start to talk about the variety of thought on why you have your calculator the way you have it, and why Glenn has his the way he has it, and some of the other factors that make this more interesting. But you see, we got one person who thinks the OSO model is more profitable. We got one who thinks private practice, duh. But you can see how their calculators bear it out a little bit differently. There's another video floating around where, and I sort of alluded to this, but the deck is stacked so much towards the private practice side, where the equity is effectively slotted as being worth nothing, which, to me, I'm someone who wants to be like logical and, probably to a fault, coldly logical, but that doesn't seem to hold water for me. I mean, you've got, financial institutions, private equity groups that are coming into this and doing these investments, and to assume that they will all go to zero. I don't know that I buy that. A lot of these private equity groups, they're used to doing transactions that return at 3 or 4 times. So I think there will be some who fail. I think we would agree with that. I think we've seen that. But I think that just because historically in the 90s there were groups that failed does not mean that every group now is going to get it wrong, or that they're all the same. And I also see, Aaron, you're using the term DSO when I think Glenn's probably itching and saying, well, this is an OSO thing. I mean, maybe not. Yeah. But there are differences there. And I'm not, I think you can play this devil's advocate game in either direction. And so that's what we're going to do now for the next 30, 40 minutes, I hope. Financial calculators. All right, we're going to push those to the side a little bit. But I do want to get into this. Glenn, your calculator, it just shows 15 years, which, probably for the average orthodontist considering this, maybe that is their timeline. But Aaron's has 5, 10, and 15. And then I think maybe even goes up to 20. I mean, you could take this, I guess I'm 40. Maybe I could do 25, 30 years, but how do you feel like the numbers, just in a general kind of high level sense, compare at 5, 10, 15, and then maybe even beyond? Glenn, why don't you talk on that a little bit?
Yeah. And first of all, I mean, people watching need to appreciate what Aaron has done. This is not like a 1 hour or 2 hour or 1 day endeavor. I mean, he sat with his CPA and gone through this. So I think both our calculators take a lot into account. Now, here's the challenge you face. And I know you said before, I think OSOs come out ahead. I really don't. There's a lot of practices out there that OSOs or DSOs are not even going to look at, right? Because their EBITDA is not big enough, and the transactional costs of bringing them into the OSO or DSO just don't make sense. But let's just say you take the 2 models that Aaron had. At the end of the day, the logic here behind the broader financial discussion, if I pay you right now for the next 6 to 8 years of your growth, which is essentially what you're getting with your 6 to 7, X multiple on your practice. If I give you that lump sum of cash right now, even if I reduce your salary, invested wisely, you should come out ahead every single time, unless you're experiencing significantly high growth. If you're growing at 20% year after year after year, you might outpace it. Because remember, private equity, these are facts. This is not conjecture. A top 25% private equity firm, not in ortho alone, but anywhere, top 25% returns 23 to 42% annually. So if you take, for instance, the Thurston Group, right? I have money invested with them. I don't have financial interest in them, but I've invested in the Thurston Group. Amazing group that's been around for decades. The fund that Dan Davis opened, Fund One, did I think 3.2x in a little over 3 years. 3.2x. We're not talking percentages, we're talking multiples. If you look at Fund Two, it's on pace to do the same. In Fund Three, which is open right now, who knows, right? We hope it does the same. But my point here is, and this is where the broader discussion, which I don't know when you want me to get into this, Kyle, I think it's later in the conversation. If one understands what private equity is as a broader sense, that it's not saying, I'm going to take my money in and out. You're turning your money over for a period of time. As I was told by a managing partner of a PE-backed firm, non-OSO, said, if I get on a call with my investors and I say the market is down 15% this year, but good news, guys, we're only down 3%, he said, I'd lose my job instantly. I'm expected to be smarter than that and to make a return every single year. And again, an average top 25%, not top, but top 25% is returning more than 25% per year. So again, if you give me the opportunity to get a lump sum of money up front and my equity, which should not be discounted in most cases, the life cycle, and we can get into it later, Kyle, you've got to give yourself at least 5 years, maybe 10, maybe 15. But once you hit that 5 to 10 years period, that's when the equity really starts to play a bigger role, because it will grow faster than you can grow your practice. And again, there's tons of equity models out there. And to be honest, the vast majority of them I would not have joined. I liked Smile Doctor's equity model, that I'm an equal partner and I get paid out at the same time as everybody else. And then I get all my money up front. Now, this isn't a plug for Smile Doctors. This is telling you that if you tell me you're going to get paid out over 5 or 7 or 10 years, I personally am not getting involved in that. If you say that my equity gets paid second, I'm not going to be a part of that. And I think one of the biggest mistakes for me, and this is all, right? Like when you say this technique works in my hands, right? Like, what does that really mean? But for me, I would not consider personally joining any OSO that is not a known brand, that doesn't have a track record. And it's not just Smile Doctors. There are others out there like this. But if all too often when I'm on these one-on-one calls, people come to me and say, they're coming to me, they got 8 orthodontists, I'm going to be one of the first ones in. You're chasing higher multiples in exchange for considerably higher risk. And maybe you want to be a big fish in a small pond. But for me, like Daryl Kane used to say, early on, capital preservation is key. So again, going back to your question, why am I not at 5 or 10 years? Because I'm hoping I'm playing the long game with my equity, because I'm going to make enough money from my upfront payment that when I post it on Facebook, if you give me $3 million now, there's no reason in 15 years I shouldn't have $20 million. That's a 14%, I believe, annual return. Nothing unreasonable, especially if you know where to look for investments. But at 5 years, didn't matter to me. That's not where I'm going to really see, how the cake turned out. And 10 years even, for most of the people listening right now, they're your cohort. I'm 56, I'll be 57. But it's usually people between 36 and 45, right? That's like the cohort that's looking at this right now. And if you want to get out completely and be gone in 5 years, God bless you. But that's not the average person I'm talking to. So I'm just doing one number, a really inaccurate 15-year number, which I think is just as inaccurate as the 5-year. But like Aaron said, where I think he and I would agree completely is the value of the calculator is if you take all the variables and make them equal, what happens at the end, right? If the interest rates are the same, if the tax rate is the same, if the amount you put aside in retirement is the same, if everything, single variable along the way is equal across the 3 different models, where do I end up? And that's a great message to get. The problem is it's not going to necessarily be equal because there's nuances. And so
all right. Let me cut you off.
Yeah.
Sorry. We're going into too long of an answer.
I apologize.
And I love you, but this is like at the presidential debates. Like, how do you interrupt somebody? We have to keep the answers shorter. We got to keep this moving, because now we're into like question 7 and 9 and 12. We're gonna get to those. So let me give Aaron. No, you're good. Let me give Aaron a chance to sort of respond to some of that. I get the point that you're making. Although I have to say, like, I think a lot of people who are thinking about the OSO model, they're thinking, yeah, I'll work the 5 years. Then I'll take the 2 years off. I'll go do my own thing. And so you talking about 10, 15 years, it's a little bit different approach. And we'll come back around to that at the very end of this with the joint venture model. And I think maybe a model that probably fills some gaps that maybe have been in the past. But Aaron, real quick thoughts on the 5, 10, 15-year thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think just like you said, there's like some people that are, hey, I'm ready to be out in 5 years, and the only reason they're even thinking about the DSO model because it gives them a really nice exit strategy. But I will say, when I look at the numbers, I mean, at 5 years, I think you can make a case that it's relatively even if you have a roughly profitable practice, like average profitable practice. But after that, I still think private practice wins in almost all cases. Now, there's some very profitable practices, or maybe an OSO or DSO is trying to recruit someone, so they're willing to pay a higher multiple that may change that. But by far, I think the majority, I mean, we're talking, at least from what I can tell, a $5 million difference in what you would have after 15 years. And even, and not to point it out, but even on Glenn's calculator, there's a few things. I had my accountant look at mine and Glenn's. There's a few things there that I think should be adjusted and corrected. Even like that, the taxes. If you have someone, the example you showed, that makes $850,000, their tax bracket is 28,000, or sorry, 28%. Well, that's $1.5 million difference over 15 years. Just that tax bracket change, and among other things. So when I looked at his, it actually showed, and I corrected for some of the duplicate additions. It actually showed they were about even at 15 years. And that's something, I know that's not fair to say because we can't really dive into that now, but maybe you and I could go over it after and just make sure I'm not seeing it wrong. But I think that there's a huge difference, and not just a little difference, in private practice versus a DSO or OSO model.
Well, let's talk this then, because some of this, it sort of sucks. This is like very presidential debate where it's like, well, your policies resulted in this, and
I know.
no, they didn't. So it's like we need a fact checker or something. But
Yeah.
I think that's okay. I think that remains to be seen. And I think if someone is interested in this, maybe they'll reach out to both of you and go through both your calculators and see, what they think. So, but let's maybe try to zoom in on this. I do think that with a calculator, and this is true of that other calculator I keep referring to, where you make certain assumptions and it really like causes things to change. You're talking about 5, 10, 15, 20 years. I mean, it can cause for massively different, like, oh, you would have had $90 million instead of $50 million. Oh, I want this option, But what are some of the assumptions that could be tweaked to make a difference between these calculators? What are maybe the 2 or 3 biggest ones, Glenn, that obviously the multiple you're getting, that's going to make a huge difference. And as Aaron showed, like your amount of overhead, obviously, if you understand even anything about EBITDA and, PE transactions and so on, like that margin is enormous. And then obviously the multiple makes a huge difference. Your $10,000 becomes $100,000 if it's a 10x multiple. I mean, it's a huge difference. So talk to me a little bit about some of those things that you can tweak, just a couple things.
I mean, EBITDA, obviously, right? I think EBITDA is number one. I think the equity, all too often people talk about the equity as being kind of, it's the cherry on top, but it's not. It is it has the potential to be a massive differentiator. And I mean, to me, those are the 2 biggest. And again, we talked about the JV model, the joint venture model. I think that fills in the gap, so to speak, like you mentioned, where you kind of can get the best of both worlds in many respects. But I think the biggest factor is how fast are you growing, right? Is your practice flat, down? And I'm not talking just last year. So if you look at a 3, 4, 5-year trend, is your practice tracking upward in a significant way? Or is the practice kind of growing at that 3, 5, 7% per year, which is nothing wrong with that. But that's going to play, I think, again, I may get hated at OSOs for saying this, but if you're growing at 20 to 25% per year over the last 3 or 4 years, you don't necessarily sell because you're betting on yourself. But if you're kind of flat to up a little bit, the private equity in a good company will likely outpace. And I think that's the biggest differentiator here.
Yeah. And tonight, in fairness, we're not getting into any other considerations of why someone, but I think it's important to say there is a justifiable emotional reason. And I don't mean to say emotional as in like I'm taking away, like it's not logical. It's just emotional. I'm just saying there are extenuating circumstances where it makes sense to sell one's practice. I have so many different conversations with people. I have people who've sold and wish they had it. And I have some that wish they could. I have some that, there's always different stories, and that's why it's impossible to say, well, it's just one way or, the highway. But, people at the end of their career, if they're able to sell their practice for X amount more than what they could in a traditional sale, or their practice is too big, maybe to find someone to buy it, or maybe they've not planned their exit the way that they maybe could have or should have. There's always extenuating circumstances. Someone's in a divorce situation, right? We've heard all these different stories, any of us who have had a lot of these conversations. And so we're not discounting those, but we're kind of trying to focus in on the numbers, as it were. So what about you, Aaron? Any things that you could shift or because you could really stack the deck if you wanted, I guess, for
sure. And it's on there. There's a few things that I probably push towards private practice, and a few things that I push towards like a OSO sale. The big one, really, what makes the difference, that's I would say is a huge difference between the two options, is that long-term capital gains. I mean, it really, if it wasn't for that, I think it'd be even more no-brainer to not sell to a DSO. But when you can be taxed at such a large sum at 20% versus maybe 30 plus, it's a big difference. But even that being aside, if you look at the numbers that at least I've calculated, even at 5 years, or someone that maybe just wants to do the short game, I still think it makes sense to do private practice. But you brought up a lot of factors that kind of come into play, like retirement, and not to do another plug, but that's what I'm hoping to be able to do as a group, is find a really good way to fill those voids that the DSO is starting to fill, or OSO is starting to fill, but we can fill it as private practice and kind of keep everything in the family, which is my goal. So I don't know if that makes any sense, but.
No, sure. And it's going to segue. I'm going to jump ahead to kind of part 3, if you're following the script, which only 3 of us have. So, you're probably not. But talking about investments, and you sort of allude to retirement, I do think one's practice or one's decision to partner with an OSO is obviously a long-term investment. And I want to talk about it in those senses. And I also want to get around to Glenn talking about cash and having it on hand and time value money and all that kind of stuff. But let's just start, Aaron, with a private practice approach. You talk about how we should view our practices as an investment. And I think you even alluded to, it's like the best investment you can make. And I've heard others say that same thing. Talk to me a little bit about that, if you don't mind.
Oh, for sure. And this is something I'm really passionate about. So when I start to go long, just cut me off. But
I will.
You're right.
I've done it before, and I'll do it again. Go ahead.
Yes. First of all, you can think of it like if you thought like an OSO, and you thought about the value of your own practice, and you just look at like returns of most industries, and Glenn threw out some numbers, but if you just look at like the real estate industry, I would say on average, you're hoping for 10% return. Obviously there's wins, and I'm in part of some investment groups where we get much higher returns than that, but 10% year over year. Well, an OSO on the minimum, when they check our practices, it's already over that. You're looking at closer to 20%. If you include us as earning the salary, then we're 25 to 30%. So if you look at it just as like, hey, if I went and bought a practice at the same price that the OSOs are paying, and I just looked at it as a straight investment, already it's a pretty good investment compared to what I'm usually looking for, which is about 20% return on my money. But if you look at your practice as like, now it's your business, you already have it. Every time you can save $100,000, and I guess my biggest push is overhead management. Every time you can save $100,000, you don't have to go out there and scratch and try to increase production. But $100,000 saves you 2.5%. It's essentially getting 2.5% more on your ROI. So every time you're spending money every year, you get an extra 2.5% if you save $100,000 on an average size practice. If I go out to, let's say I want to invest into my practice, and I'm looking at it as an ROI type of scenario. If I take lunch to a doctor and it costs me $100, but they like me and start referring me 2 patients a month, then I make another $100,000 a year. And I think I did the math on that, right? Yeah. And then, I mean, that's like 1,000x return on my investment of money and time. So you have these little pockets where you can also just invest in your practice and making it more successful. If you get a software like Wave, is what I use, and they have a lot of features in there where you can eliminate a lot of front desk staff tasks. Well, you eliminate one person from your office, that's $50,000. That's a huge return on your investment, and it didn't cost you anything. You just had to change the systems, and now you have less staff. And so, it's there's so many opportunities for you to invest your time and money to make it more profitable. That, I mean, it's just exciting when you see one change, and all of a sudden your overhead's down 5%. That's a big deal if you have a big practice. So I look at it from not only as an investment for a great investment for OSO, but a great investment for you on a day-to-day basis.
All right, that makes sense. And I guess maybe this starts to become a conversation around different types of doctors, and ones that maybe have a personality type that almost precludes them from, selling to an OSO or being a good candidate for that. Which, Glenn, it sounds like you've had a lot of conversations. You'd say, "Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely." And I think there was one other thing. We won't go too much into it, but I think as you're trying to decide in this moment, is this the time to sell this practice and to partner with an OSO for all the reasons that there would be?
That's the answer.
Well, your answer is no. Okay, fair enough. I do think that somebody, I can't remember who it was, put up some kind of worst case scenarios, for if you're holding this investment. And of course, Aaron, you strike me as someone that it's always going to be growing. It's always going to be getting better. But just to bring it up again, I'm a moderator here. I have to try to be,
I
fair.
have one comment on that. Yeah, I did.
Well,
like
let me rate it real quick. It is a pretty
Okay,
good
go.
question. Is that, we all assume our private practices are going to continue to grow, but what if your practice begins to decline? Okay, fair enough. What if you get hurt, have a family crisis, there's an unforeseen event, it significantly affects your ability to, foster this investment, as you said. How do you factor in these worst case scenarios from a risk assessment perspective? Maybe a quick answer on that.
Yeah, quick answer. Obviously, insurance, some joint groups where you can cover each other's practices. I mean, that's some stuff, but I feel like the risk is equal in an OSO scenario. I mean, if I have my way in 5 to 10 years, if I'm successful in creating what I want to create, that there's a risk that none of y'all may get your equity out of that because they all fail. So, it's still a risk, but
yeah,
I don't mean it in a bad way, Glenn. I'm just trying to be humorous.
Yeah, no, the humor came through very much so.
Okay, good.
Yeah, no,
I mean, see him smile, and I thought, okay, maybe that was offensive, but
he's scrolling the internet in the background while you talk. That's what he's doing right now. So he's looking up.
I feel like the risk is equal in either scenario. Is what basically.
Well, there's risk on either side for sure, and I think that's where the financial calculator, it can only be so accurate in its assumptions because there's a lot of things that will change. And I mean, goodness gracious, it'd be like it's trying to predict what the wind's going to do or the weather. So, so Glenn, go ahead, Aaron, if you have one last little thought.
Last little quick thing. You think about some people are able to grow a large practice and able to maintain that, but some people can't, right? Some people they just don't have maybe the ability or the desire. Almost everyone can reduce their overhead. And so if you're not the type that's like, hey, I can't do a big practice or I can't figure out a way to grow it, you can always decrease your overhead. And, you think about what's the difference. Last little thing, but you think about what's the difference between a $750,000 practice at 23% overhead, which exists, versus a $2 million practice at 73% overhead, which also exists. They make the same, but one's doing twice as much work or more than twice as much work. I mean, if you're not the type that's trying to go big, then just try to go small, and there's a lot of room there for you. So,
yeah, right on.
Kyle, can I touch that just for a second?
Yeah, of course.
I think it's obvious, and I respect the hell out of Aaron. But he's obviously very pro private practice, right? That's his sort of raison d'être, so to speak, right? I'm truly ambivalent on the concept, but like my calculator, for instance, when I run the numbers, even with the minor changes, and some of which Aaron was talking about, actually favor the private practice. And if I correct them, we'll work towards the partial sale model. I'm yet to find a case where it's even a close match 15 years later, but agreed, you might want to get out sooner than 15 years. But you can't take a small practice and just lower the overhead. Fixed costs, being what they are, hamstring younger doctors or people with smaller practices. I have this conversation literally dozens of times a year with doctors who reach out to me through Orthopreneurs and say, hey, my practice is 1.5 million. I've tried growing it. I really can't. My overhead is 65, 70%, and my rent is high. I work in an area where staff costs are high. And there are, not all, but many cases, again, knowing full well that I am a fan of private practice. I think there is a place for private practice for most, if not all, or some, right? It's going to move the needle one way or another. But there are many, many cases where you need to produce yourself out of high overhead, right? Where your fixed costs now become a smaller percentage of your overall practice. And I've heard the message said many times, you know what, you don't need a giant practice, right? Aaron has a decent sized practice. I have a decent sized practice, but not everybody wants the $3, $4, $5, $6 million practice. But in today's day and age, having listened to dozens of doctors, it's really hard to run that uber low, like my dad had 30 years ago kind of practice. It's just hard in most metropolitan areas. Rural, I think it's possible, where wages are lower, rents are lower, but even nice suburban and urban, it is tough. Not saying it can't happen, but just like, hey, let's cut our overhead 5%. There's people listening right now who I know for a fact have reached out to me who just can't. And again, in the same way that a small practice may not be a good fit for an OSO. So sorry for the longer answer there. I just wanted to throw that in there real quick.
No, it's completely off topic, and I love it. It's funny. I was on a call before this talking about like what I perceive to be the biggest issue for the next 5 years for the industry of orthodontics, or the profession, I should say. And it is, I think, increasing margins. And I think that's a product of inflation, what we're having to pay staff. You know, you used to be able to pay $12 an hour, $13 an hour. Now it's no one wants less than $20 an hour. You know, the rent's too damn high. You remember that guy that ran in New York on that? That was his entire policy platform, was the rent's too damn high.
Technology.
Technology is increasing. And then I think also willingly, I think orthodontists are spending more money than they should on certain things. And yeah, so Aaron, now that this has been brought up, this is total presidential debate. Now, because you were mentioned, you get 30-second rebuttal. So go ahead, and then we'll get back on script.
I mean, my rebuttal is that I disagree a lot about it. So, I mean, just because I've seen it, and even still to this day, it's possible to run under 40% without working too hard to get there. And maybe just because I've seen it and done it, that I think it's so possible. But you look at Glenn Dubrock. I mean, he's the perfect example. Now he hasn't been practicing. I don't know him that well, but I think he's been out for a little bit. But I've known several doctors who have, made their whole career functioning in that realm. And I think it's still possible and not that hard.
Well, so we have a doctor in the chat from the DC area who says overhead is astronomical. I mean, I have had those conversations with people, whether it's, San Francisco area, it's, Manhattan, obviously, it's DC. I do think probably the vast majority of orthodontists are in areas where you do have more control over the overhead, such that it should not be at 70%. But Glenn obviously has a lot of conversations with a lot of the orthodontists, probably as much as just about anybody. Chris Benson's floating around in the chat. He's probably up there in terms of conversations had with different types of orthodontists. And we'll see maybe if he kind of sprinkles in some commentary on that. But let's get back on the script. Obviously, we're not going to agree on everything. And hey, that's the beauty of this show. But I love the drama. This is great. We're just ratcheting it up. I love it.
Crazy,
so Glenn, talk to me a little bit about cash on hand, time value of money, your investment return. I've seen that be criticized recently on, that's too high of an investment return expectation. I was talking to Kevin McGrory before this, just genius, smart,
amazing
person. And, he was talking about his percentage expectations. And I think he's very much mentally in line with you, Glenn, on kind of what he expects and why he views it this way. But make your pitch for that. And then we'll come back to another question. Go ahead.
I mean, it's not a pitch, right? I know it's the word you use.
Well, I don't mean pitch.
Up over it. I'm just saying. I made that post, for those who may not be aware, in Orthopreneurs, that I said, give me $3 million or some number like that, and you're going to get the $40 million or whatever number it was at some point. And much of it was hyperbole, just to sort of get the ball rolling. But the responses I got after that post were remarkable. There was a lot of people who fundamentally said, I think the question was the follow-up, if you're going to speak to your financial advisor and you say to them, I expect this return every year, what is that number? And I was seeing people say 6%, 5%, 8%. The number of people in the financial services industry, people who are brokers, people who were CPAs who reached out to me privately after I posted that and saw the responses, said it was incredulous. They couldn't believe that people are going to their financial advisor and saying, I want 6% per year. Now, your financial advisor may say 6% per year, but one of the things that Chris Benson himself told me, and I'm going to give a shout out to Chris, what he says from the stage over the last decade, I would say much more of it has come true than not. The guy really knows what he's talking about. And before I joined Smile Doctors, Chris said to me, Glenn, I don't know why, but when you join, you're suddenly going to start getting opportunities financially that you wouldn't have beforehand. Now, Aaron mentioned investment clubs are great places. You should join one and be a part of them and get some great. But all of a sudden, I'm at a Smile Doctors meeting and I'm talking to some doctor who I've gotten to know. And I say, hey, what's going on in your life? Oh, yeah, Glenn, are you interested in real estate? Because there's this amazing deal that I've been in for 5 years. They're taking investors again. And all of a sudden, it's not an investment club, but you have access to people in the room. Everybody there got a huge payout at some point, for the most part. And they had to come up with places to put their money. And I was doing this one-on-one with somebody who said, Glenn, you need to say this publicly and talk about this. And it's not to say you can't get those investment advice elsewhere, but it's one of those things that Chris told me. And I then called 2 doctors who were already affiliated with Smile Doctors and said, is there any truth to this? And both said, yeah, just wait. And again, it's one of those things that I wouldn't join an OSO simply for that. But that's the cherry on top, in my opinion. That's a nice side effect, is that you're sitting in a room, at least with Smile Doctors, and I'm sure it's the same with many other OSOs, where there's a couple of hundred people in the room who all went through the same path of getting a very large amount of money that you did. And they had to come up with a place to put it. And they're not looking for 6 or 7 or 8%. And so we've gotten into some startups. We've gotten into some venture capital. We've gotten into some private equity. We've gotten into some commercial real estate. We've gotten into development. There's lots of opportunities out there if you're looking for them. And they're there even if you're not part of any OSO, but you got to have the cash to be able to do it. And for many doctors out there, they just don't have the cash, and getting it and being in that network changes things. But again, that's not why I would join an OSO. You can do exactly what Aaron's talking about and join an investment club and get some great advice there because there's some smart people. But did I answer your question, Kyle?
Yeah,
okay.
that was well said. And I think, again, this is so like personality driven, because I think there's some people that hear that and they're like, oh, that sounds risky. And what if it doesn't work? And and so we're not going to go down that road. It's just fun. This is fun for me because you guys are very different.
Yeah,
So,
and Kyle, the one thing I want to add to that is, I just want to add that Aaron is a rugged individualist. This is a guy who is not afraid. He's probably the most prepared financially of anybody I've ever spoken to one-on-one. This is a guy who's going to find a way no matter what. He's going to figure it out. He loves diving into the puzzle, and kudos to him for that. That's remarkable. But there's also a huge number of people on the other side who say, like you said, where do I even begin? I'm not doing this. And it's nice to be part of a group where investment club or OSO, where you're going to get that information.
Yeah. Let me share this because I think it's important. Jeannie Moody said that my haircut is on fire. Push them on this, be fierce. Yeah. So I felt like that was important to share. So apparently if you comment on my private Facebook profile, I can see those comments and share them, but not inside the Facebook group where I want people watching, where we've had over an audience of like 115, which is a lot for a live audience. It's fantastic. So great job, gentlemen. Let's shift into this. We have a question that was pre-submitted by Dr. Andy Sarpadar, whoever that is. And are there any factors that both guests can agree on that would be the right and wrong reasons to sell to a DSO OSO? Just sort of a fun palate cleanser of a question. Aaron, why don't you start? Any right or wrong reasons to sell? I don't know.
I think, and this is something I think we agree on. If you put weight into the equity portion, and those in the company you're part of goes big, or they recapitalize several times. I mean, you can make it big. And I feel like, or if you have a very profitable practice and they're willing to give you a really high multiple, I mean, you can make it big, and there are people that have and just killed it. I think, again, for the majority, that's not the case, but I do think there are scenarios out there where it plays out really well for them.
Yeah. I got to give kudos to Jason Tam. He always shows up in the chat. I think he's an incredibly smart businessman and has done really well for himself. And so, yeah, we're talking percentages and averages here in this conversation. I think we both agree, all three of us collectively agree, that there's situations where it was the right decision, situations where it was the wrong decision. But Glenn, what are some, if you can kind of generalize?
The exact question again, Kyle?
Yeah, sure. Oh, and I forgot, I got questions here. I'm just off tonight. I don't know. What are some right and wrong reasons to sell to DSO, OSO?
Yeah, I mean, for me, the equity side played a huge role, right? Like Aaron said, which is why I chose Smile Doctors. They've been through an equity turn twice. So, if you're going to put all your eggs in one basket, you better try to stack the deck in your favor as much as you can. So I think equity is a huge play here. The number one thing I tell everybody about any transaction that they're ever going to make is the wrong reason is fear. Don't ever go into anything because of fear. Oh, my practice is shrinking, which, by the way, a shrinking practice is not really that enticing to anybody to buy, right? Unless they're getting a fire sale on it. But don't make any decision in your life. You're talking like candidate. Here's my George Bush thumb right here. Don't make any decision in life because you're afraid of the consequence of not doing. Right. So like if your practice is going downhill a little bit, or you're scared, or you're worried, and I'm going to pull the ripcord and get out and sell, to me, that's the wrong reason to make any decision. Don't let it be motivated by greed. Don't let it be motivated by fear. Sit down with other people who can help walk you through it. And again, I think if you're small, if you're really a smaller practice, and I'm not going to define small, but an EBITDA less than 500,000 is generally not really wanted by most OSOs. But if you're on the smaller end, it could be a real mistake for you to sell, because, as Aaron alluded to earlier, your potential upside is huge. If you're a single doc doing 5 mil a year, you're going to grow it, but you're going to scale out at some point, and it's probably a good idea to maybe consider looking at that. But if you're like $1 million and $1.4 million practice, and you've done well with your overhead, and you got maybe, let's call it a 400, 500,000 EBITDA, you got so much upside there that if you just, like Aaron said, turn the machine on just a little bit, the return on your investment is going to be massive. And I would do that before I would associate with an OSO personally.
Yeah. Fear being a motivator. I think that was like in the initial years of the OSO kind of gold rush, as I would call it. That was a big motivator. I think there was like a fear of missing out. Yeah, a little bit of FOMO, I think. I do need to say this. It was just apparent to me that when Jeannie complimented my haircut, my wife cuts my hair. I just want to say that. So if Anna's watching, great job. She also applied my makeup before we went on, which embarrassingly Glenn and Aaron saw. So that's the last time I'm going to go back to that comment, but it was an important thing. Go ahead, Aaron.
Your hair does look great, by the way. It looks amazing.
I agree. Yep.
I do have one thing, because I didn't comment on what the wrong reason is. And I would say, if you think, at least for me, I get so many people that think like, hey, I'm gonna be rich. I'm just gonna like kill it, and this is going to be the answer to all of my problems and financial problems. And I just feel like everything I've seen, especially when we look at it at the numbers, I don't feel like that's the case for most people. And I've already said that, but I just don't think. I think if you're going to do it, you should have a few reasons more than just you're going to get rich. So.
Yeah, big lump of cash. Undisciplined people with a big lump of cash is never really something that works out great. I think maybe that is the thread that I see between the two of you, is to whatever degree you're different, is you're both using either the decision not to sell or the decision to sell as a jumping off point for greater opportunity. And I think that's predicated on discipline and vision and really an entrepreneurial spirit on either side. And so, yeah, if you're entrepreneurial and talented and disciplined, you can't lose. And so, and I'm not trying to be overly ecumenical about it, because I do think that there's truth to be found here, but I do think that that is the case. And so if you think that joining with an OSO is going to be where you just now have to not worry about anything, and you can just, go sit around on your couch and not do anything, which I hear sometimes people say that. It's like, oh, I could finally relax. Like, I don't think that really bears out. And I think you're probably going to be miserable. And I think conversely, if you think just holding your private practice and being lazy and undisciplined is going to work out for you, Well, probably not. And so, I think if I'm Glenn, I would say that, well, by joining and partnering with these impressive people, it's going to help you, all tides lift all ships or whatever. I'm ruining that analogy, right?
A rising tide lifts all boats.
Yeah, that one. I think there's probably some truth to that, but I think maybe that's why Aaron is kind of figuring out, and some other private practicing orthodontists are figuring out, like the idea of a co-op is probably attractive, and groups have been attractive. Having a tribe, having people that push you. I'm a member of Glenn's group, Entrepreneurs RD. There's a little plug. That was truly a plug. But it's great because it kind of keeps me honest and keeps me pushing and so on. So we've got a few questions left. We have just a fantastic audience. It looks like Anna saw the comment about the haircut. Thank the Lord. And thank you for the haircut. Let's go into this. Glenn, let's talk equity. We've danced around the topic, but
Cool.
equity is a significant consideration with corporate offers, I think. How do
Yeah.
doctors know what the equity will actually be worth, and what are the key factors to consider? I don't have this written down, but I'd also like to talk a little bit about when you can get your equity out, because there's been some kind of confusion about that. So go ahead.
This is arguably the most misunderstood part of the whole model. And I think it's also arguably the most important. And by the way, just ecumenical, the word of the evening, I think it's important just to pause for a second here and say, don't listen to me, don't listen to Aaron, don't listen to Kyle.
No,
At the
listen
end
to
of
me.
the day, every single person listening who's an orthodontist, you're going to retire just fine. We're all going to have more than enough money, however you go, as long as you're somewhat responsible in your life. What Aaron's calculator will show, what my calculator will show, is that the numbers with the amount of zeros on the right side of the ledger are going to be humongous for you if you just make even the most basic of decisions in your practice life. And so there's no major loss here one way or the other. And I just wanted to say that out loud because it's really important to recognize. And I said it earlier, we're going to do better than 99.9% of the globe doing a job that we really never have to sweat, where we're respected in the community and we get to change people's lives. I mean, it's a blessing in every way you look at it. So again, we can split hairs on numbers, DSO, OSO, not. At the end of the day, we're all going to do great. So just remember that. So going to the equity side of it, the first thing that people need to understand about equity, private equity, this is not a stock. This is not a mutual fund. You cannot just say, here's $500,000 or here's $25,000, take my money and work it. You can do that through larger institutions that invest their money into private equity. But if you take, say, the Thurston Group, where I'm invested, there's a minimum threshold to put your money in that is significant. And it doesn't start at the low six figures, okay? There's a significant amount of money you need to put in. In return, you're usually going to pledge it to them you're going to pledge it to them until they give it back to you. Now, how long is that time frame? That time frame, generally, if you're a pension fund giving money, right? Big institutional investors into private equity, they go there for a reason. Because by pledging your money for an amount of time, the manager knows that you're not just going to pull it out. So they can look for strategies that a lot of stocks and mutual funds can't, because you've seen the news, something bad happens or they want to pull their money out. It makes Wall Street news and all of a sudden the stock goes up and down. And in this case, they could be long-term holds in companies that they're developing that are going to get taken over in 2, 3, 4 years. So private equity, as my attorney, when I did this, explained to me, is private equity. It's their equity. You can't pull it out. Once you put the money in, right? Once they have your equity, it's there by their rules. And that's going to turn a lot of people off. But understanding that if you just go with the flow and do what most institutional, large, and wealthy investors, right? The old saying is Bill Gates didn't get wealthy through his stock market. Well, technically he did with Microsoft stock, but the point being is the wealthy get wealthier, not by getting 6 or 8% a year. They throw it into things like private equity. So they hold onto your money. You can't get it back, but in return, you're going to probably get a better return. Now, the life cycle I just told you is about 5 years. At about 5 years, you're going to see most companies, whether they want to or not, are going to start going through an equity transaction. They're going to change, right? The company perhaps started at an EBITDA of $20 million, and now they've grown it through cost-cutting measures or good overhead control or acquiring more EBITDA. Now they're at 40 million EBITDA. Now, my cousin started a private equity firm in Hamburg, Germany. So when I wanted to go through this process, he was instrumental in speaking to the private equity companies on my behalf and then sort of mansplaining it to me and explaining to me what was going on. And so what happens is this company goes from 20 to 40 million. It's outside their portfolio to say, or their what's the right word, profile, to take on a 40, 50, 60, 70. They play in the $20 million space. So when they get to that certain size, they need a bigger company to come in whose goal is to play in the 40, 50, 60 million and buy them out at a higher price than the one they paid. The investors get paid back. The money is now given back. But take Smile Doctors, for instance. When they've gone through it, the investor who's spending the money gets to always, across the board in all private equity, make the rules generally on what you as an investor can do. So again, can it be scary? Absolutely. If you have $2 million in equity and you get a 2.5x multiple on it, so you have $5 million of equity now in a company, and an equity transaction occurs, the company that's buying does not want everybody, as we talked about earlier, it's 5 years, everybody says, I'm retiring, I want my equity back. So everybody leaves. The company just invested in a company where everybody just pulled their money out. They can't let that happen. So the rules could say you can take it up to 60%, or you can take it up to 40%, or you can take up to 20%. And there have even been cases, rare, where they say you can't take out any money. But at the end of the day, private equity makes its money on the equity. So the equity is more valuable to them than the cash. Cash isn't going to grow. Equity will. So if you got a deal for $10 million and you said to them, hey, can you up the deal a little bit for me? I don't want any equity. There's a reasonable chance that'll happen. But if you say to them, I want 60% equity and 40% cash, ain't going to happen. That's how they make their money. But this is important because 5-year time frames. So when you do your calculator, right, 5 years is about the limit of where you're going to go in most life cycles of private equity. And nobody within reason would argue with you that a 5-year 2.5x would be an unreasonable rate of return for most private equity over time. Now, let's just say the question that I get asked a lot is, okay, I've signed up with a company. I've taken a 5-year contract. And remember, your purchase and sale agreement is generally different than your contract. They're buying your assets and they're signing you as an employee. So you got a 5-year employment agreement, let's just say, and at 5 years, there's no equity transaction, right? The equity transaction happened at year 4. You got 2.5x on your money. Let's say 2x, doesn't matter, right? You had 2 million, now you got 4 million. You got 4 million in private equity, but now you've worked a year longer. There's no private equity transaction. You can't just pull your money out at that point because it usually comes out at equity events, right? The money that the company has that's been given to them by the bank isn't designed to pay you back. It's designed to acquire more EBITDA, operating costs, things like that. So now what do? As was explained word for word from my attorney, his point is you have no say in what happens to the money, but if private equity makes its money on private equity, on the equity side, and they believe the company is doing better, they will likely want to write you a check for your equity at that point to buy it back because they know it's going to be worth more 2 or 3 years. Now, again, I just told you, the money they have in their coffers is not necessarily earmarked to buy you out. So you may just have to sit there on that money, and as it get closer to an equity transaction, right? If you're close to an equity transaction, stay in it until the equity transaction and pull your money out. But again, at the end of the day, it's a very complex process that you have to understand. And to Aaron's point, if you're risk averse and you're scared and you don't know, it could be a scary place. I'm not worried because of the track records that I've seen, but most importantly, this is where the organization you join is going to be key. And that's why I always caution people, if you're joining a company that's never been through it before, that's new, and they make you, and I was made promises like you cannot believe by brokers who wanted me to step in and start one of these things. They're going to tell you you're going to get 6, 7, 8x. Why? It's like a penny stock. You could lose it all way easier. So your return is going to be potentially higher. But you have to ask yourself the question, what are you looking for in the smaller, lesser known, riskier investments that you can't get in going to one of the big names who has literally $1 billion+ valuations? And while nothing's too big to fail, as we've learned, they have a degree of safety where if I speak to a number of really well-respected brokers, the idea of your equity vanishing or being stuck in, worse yet, purgatory, as I described, where you can't get your money out, and it's happened to a lot of these smaller no names. That's the worst. The worst case scenario is not it disappearing, because chances that's not going to happen. Someone's going to buy and take it over. The worst case scenario is 10, 15, 20 years later, there's no takers for it for one reason or another, and your money's just sitting there. And so sorry for the long answer there, but we could do this for 2 hours and still not fully explain it. But I hope that gave a broad overview about what makes private equity transact and why a 5-year lifespan is important. And for most, don't be greedy and look for this 4, 5, 6, 7x. If someone says to you, I'm going to give you X amount of dollars, and in 5 years, you'll have 2.5 to 3x, I would take that all day long. So anyway, sorry for the long answer, guys, there, but I hope that helps people better understand.
It does. Aaron, any kind of quick thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, he explained equity, and I think, I think the really important part that I would grab onto is, sometimes it does get, you don't have control over when that comes out. So if your game is, hey, I want to retire in 5 years and I want to be out, while that can happen, you may find that it's locked up a little bit longer. And so I think there's a way, if you're going to sell, you would structure a certain way. But I guess the part that I worry about in the scenario described is that if you, especially in orthodontics, because there are different industries where I think equity it's awesome. But in orthodontics, it's very, I think, advantageous for us, especially if you want out, is you sell, you ride out your 5 years, you're done, and you get all your money. And I think that if maybe the best way to put it is you may not end up getting all that money. And given that a lot of the successful orthodontists that started these practices are, with the original model of Smile Doctors, how after 5 years, you could be out. All the ones that grew these amazing practices are out. Well, the value of that portfolio, I imagine, would start to decline, which I think is part of the reason why they switched the joint venture model. And I also think the joint venture model gets you locked in for a lot longer, because now you have ownership still in the practice, and then, worrying about getting rid of that. So it's almost like they don't have to put as much money to lock in your practice. You don't get as much money hoping that you'll recapitalize in the future, but you may find that never comes. And so, we talked about maybe the joint venture model being the best of both worlds. I would honestly say it's to some degree the worst of both worlds, at least the way I look at it. And I don't know if that's something that if we need to jump into with the calculators if we have time, but
let's jump into that, because that was a point that Glenn wanted to get into. There was a question about tax benefits. Maybe we can come back to it, but since you brought up joint venture, let's get into that, because that will not be a term that everyone is familiar with, and we'll kind of end with this. So Glenn, I'll put that to you. Joint venture model, JV model, not junior varsity, joint venture. Explain this model just succinctly, and then why is it, in your view, advantageous? And then Aaron's already shown his hand. Why is it disadvantageous, I guess?
Yeah.
So go ahead.
I would just say, I think this is the first time tonight where I think Aaron really took a very biased opinion on this. I think there was so much naysaying in that comment that's just specious. It's just not true. I think there's a lot of conjecture in it of this is bad and that's bad and this could go south, but it hasn't. And it's not to say it won't, but there was somebody who said the other day, I think I was roasted on another podcast or webinar. Someone, you saw it, Kyle. We chatted a little bit about it. He had so much information on that was so wrong about why companies acquire ortho practices. I love the fact that ortho practice is part of private equity. Why? We make 50 cents on the dollar. Find me other companies that private equity invests in, whether it's healthcare, beauty, what have you. We have such a huge amount of money we make on every transaction that we are insulated in a way that most companies are not. And so the joint venture model isn't to lock people in for a longer period of time. You want to lock me in? Give me a de novo, which I just opened my first practice with Doug, my partner, Doug Shaw, best partner on the planet. We just opened the doors 3 weeks ago on a practice that we are partners with Smile Doctors as a de novo. You want to lock somebody in? Give us an opportunity. You'll lock us in a little bit longer. But the joint venture model came about because partly what Aaron's talking about, right? But for a different reason. If I buy 100% of your assets, I don't care if it's an ortho practice, a barber shop, Anna's makeup company, right? I don't care. There you go, Anna. Shout out for you. I don't care what I buy. It's human nature that when you've received, and again, Aaron had talked about getting your money. I didn't know if he was referring to equity or cash. I would not have done any deal that didn't pay me all my money up front, right? Like J.G. Wentworth, it's my money and I want it now, right?
Mhm.
And so I got paid all my deal. 80% was cash given to me at the beginning. Day one, I signed the contract. Next morning, it's in my bank account. And 20% roughly, in most cases, goes into equity. That's the money we're talking about. We talk about it's being deferred out. And again, I can't speak for models other than Smile Doctors, but if we go through an equity transaction, my equity is equal to everybody else's, and there's no stipulations or weirdness. And that's why I'm very comfortable with my equity. And some people are in deals that, like Aaron said, I'd be a little bit concerned about. But what they did is they said, look, if I'm giving you all your cash up front, it's human nature potentially for you to say, other than an earnout here and there that you can make, what's your incentive to continue growing? Well, your equity is your incentive, but that can be a little bit amorphous for a lot of people, right? I'm building this thing that 5 years from now hopefully grows. And, I hope everybody else is working this hard. So the joint venture model is really nice in the sense that they'll never take a minority interest in your practice for obvious reasons. I'm not going to buy your asset that I have no say over in any way, shape, or form, right? That'd just be silly. But let's assume they take 60% of your practice and you keep 40. And using just round numbers, you've got a $3 million practice at 50% overhead, which is taking on $1.5 million. You're taking your $350,000, or let's call it $300,000, even less, $250,000 salary on your $1.5 million. So the remaining cash is $1.25. I know this is an oversimplification, but let's just say it's $1.25 million. You get your salary of your $250,000, just making up a number, and you're getting 40% of the $1.25. So you're taking home an additional $500,000 on top of your $250,000. And now you've got an incentive, right? A real incentive, like tangible. I need to grow this practice because if I can grow it an extra $100,000, I take home an extra $40,000. So it's their way of saying, now they can buy a portion of your practice at a certain time period at a set multiple, usually 6.5x, and then they buy the second half down the road. There are other companies out there. MB2 is the only other one I know of that has this kind of model. But last time I checked, the last 15%, you had to sell to an individual. You couldn't do it. But the way their model works is different. And again, MB2, joint venture model, generally speaking, that's how they run. It was recently told to me by a CEO of another company, arguably one of the best managed cash positions of any company in the OSO DSO world. So again, it's not a horrible model. They've made it work spectacularly well. Their doctors are very happy. And I don't think that Smile Doctors does a lot of the 100% anymore. I think it's mostly joint venture, along with the de novo, right? That's another way we talked about keeping people in. The Aqua Novo, where they're going to acquire that older practice in the community, where if Aaron says, hey, there's this older doc near me and I want to buy it, right? He's going at it. I know the guy, he's great. I want to buy his practice. You can go in partnership with Smile Doctors and buy that practice, build it up, grow it, because you
Aqua Novo. That feels like a term that shouldn't exist.
Doesn't it? It's an acquisition de novo. But again, at the end of the day, the joint venture model pays you a pro rata share. So if you're $10 million deal, you're not getting $10 million. They're buying 60%, so you're going to get a $6 million deal. The $4 million is, so to speak, left on the table, but that comes to you in your profits. And again, we could sit here and debate back and forth. Is it good? Is it not good? Really, the numbers are going to be unique for every individual. And as you alluded to earlier, the entrepreneurial spirit of that doctor. Because if your goal is to get into a joint venture model and then just do this, you're not maximizing the benefit.
Yeah, I think clearly, like, the idea of the JV model is to try to address this, because it's kind of how I saw the corporate model when it started. This is just me. Is you work your 5 years, you kind of punch your card and you get out. And you've seen people doing that, and people opening up across the street once the restrictive covenant is up. And that is not to the benefit of the OSO for sure, no matter how you slice it. And so this makes sense for them to evolve as such. And you alluded to MB2. Any person I've had a conversation with who's in the OSO world, they call them the belle of the ball, because they're doing well or whatever. I think that's what you're alluding to. And I have to say, you mentioned equity, And you also, man, there's been a lot of comments here. You talked about Aaron being specious. I have to give Aaron an opportunity to talk. Where was I specious? We do know of some groups where the equity has gone to zero or close to zero, or it has gone to where it should not be. So I understand you're advocating for your group that you feel confident in, and you have every right to do
Or
so.
other
But
groups. There are many other groups out there. Just don't go to the no-name starter up. You're going to be our first orthodontist or one of 5. You're
well,
really
they said they were going to call it the Fagala OSO, and I just felt like that was fun. So I was actually offered to start an OSO, and I said absolutely not. So it's
No way.
just not in my blood. But Aaron, respond to some of these comments if you want to. I did
Yeah.
I wanted to kind of stop it right then and say, Glenn, where was he being specious? Because I love that word.
You know,
But
he probably feel my passion for it because
yeah,
honestly, from an OSO point of view, if I started an OSO, the joint venture model is the only way to go because it keeps doctors engaged. You don't have to invest as much. Like it really is the genius way to go for an OSO. And so I can understand why Smile Doctors and why MB2 have gone that way. But I'm not an OSO, and I hate and at least the way I view it, maybe because I love private practice so much. I feel like I would be a pawn in their game where they're like, all right, let's just keep him going. I would love nothing more to be like the master of my own destiny and not have to have someone necessarily structuring my deal in that way to keep me motivated. And so again, from maybe Glenn's perspective, because I would say he is on maybe that side of things, it totally makes sense. But for the rest of us, I kind of hate it. And
let me ask this question. So if your EBITDA is, let's just make it easy, 6x, I think I think your estimates were maybe a little higher on the joint venture model, maybe 7x
yeah,
or
I did
something here.
7. I think you can get 7 to 8 on a joint venture model because again, they usually have you longer. Not they have you longer. Like you're going to be there
So
more than the 5 years.
if as Glenn said, 60% of that is paid up front, 40% is held on to kind of on the table effectively. It's in the ether. What is the multiple that it transacts at when you exit? What does that 40% trade at? It's not going to trade at the 7.5. Is that accurate, or what happens? Aaron, what do you think happens? Glenn, what do you think happens?
I think some of that we don't know yet because it hasn't happened from what I understand a lot. I think Glenn would say it happens at the 6.5 because that's what Smile Doctors has kind of alluded to. I would say it probably will be closer to 2 or 0 if they don't make it. So, and it will be a lot lower, I think, than your original. So that's why I'm a proponent. If you decide to sell to an OSO, I would say try to sell it all, try to get the highest multiple you can, try to make sure it's the most profitable practice you can. Get your money because the chance of you getting 6 to 7 to 8 later on, I think, is a lot lower than you're going to get when they don't have your practice yet and they're trying to get you in.
Glenn, what would you say to that? Would you say the exact opposite?
No, I would not say the exact opposite. I think Aaron makes some great points, and you know, again, when people can make assumptions about your practice and say things about you, and then you're in your morning huddle, you really know what's going on. And as he alluded to, I don't think I'm actually allowed to say out loud what the multiples are, but let's just say I would never do anything that's not pre-negotiated. Right, the exit needs to be pre-negotiated. I can tell you it's higher than 6x. That I will tell you. For Smile Doctors, I can't speak to anybody else, right? Because I don't know what they're doing. But at the end of the day, Smile Doctors at their last equity transaction, I think in 2022, I think it was like a $2.4 billion company. Now that's a different animal than some of the companies that are out there. And I can tell you how amazing I think Smile Doctors is. I could point you to 30, 50, 75, 100 other doctors who feel the same way. And I could find 100 people like Aaron who are going to say, I just don't trust them. I don't think right. And who's right and who's wrong? Everybody and nobody. But if you go to the people who really look at these objectives, and I think I'm going to call Chris Benson out again because he's as honest as the day is long. He's been right more than he's been wrong. And I will tell you that I don't want to put words in his mouth. I'll just say, having talked to him, I feel much better about my prospects long-term with Smile Doctors than I did before talking to him. And I already felt pretty good about them. We, again, understanding private equity world, money is flowing back into the market, and neither myself nor Aaron really know where this is headed. I'm not a fan of the 100% buyout, even though that's what I did. If the JV model were there, I would have gone the JV model all day long. Why? Because I'm not in this for the 5-year play. I mean, I'm 56, but if I could continue working, I would. I want to let my equity continue growing. So again, we can sit here all day long going back and forth on it, and it's a great exercise. But the only real thing that's going to tell us is time. And again, I think there's more of a safety in any number of 3 or 4 companies that are out there. And I will tell you, Chris Benson told me back in the day, 21, everything he's saying is coming true. He said, I think if you look 5 or 10 years down the road, there are going to be 3 or 4 big players in the industry. And you'll see a lot of the other little ones fall off, or they're going to get purchased by the big boys. And I think that's the name of the game in most industries.
All right, Aaron, real quick rebuttal, and then we're going to go to the last question and wrap it up.
No, this is actually,
yeah.
I would say not a rebuttal, but a confirmation. If you were to if you're going 15 years and you look at selling 100%, or you're selling, or you're keeping like that joint venture model, and I don't think we'll have time to look at it, but I do have some graphs and numbers to show. You will do better over the long term doing the joint venture model. Not as good as private practice, but you will do better than selling outright. And that's because
I have the slides. Really, I'll show them.
Yeah, you can go and maybe just go to that last graph so you can kind of see. I don't know if it matters. Okay, so if you look at the 100% sell on the left and the partial sell on the right, in the short term, the 100% sell is better. But over the long term, the partial sell or the JV model is better. And to me, that just shows how profitable or how great of an investment your practice is. So even you owning 40% of your practice still is still an amazing investment compared to what you could do, just at like investing in the market at 7 to 10%. Now, if you own 100% of your practice and you keep it over that term, obviously that's the best model. But the second best, I would say, if you're doing long-term, the second best would be the joint venture model.
And Kyle, I'm just going to add, it's coming from 2 different directions. I've never in a profitable practice had the 100%, the maintenance of the practice ever come close to the JV model. The 100%, it's beaten at times. I've never, ever, even adjusting numbers in any way I could, you have to make the situation perfect. So you'll have Aaron on one side saying he's always getting the private practice better. I've never had the private practice within 20% of the JV model in a profitable practice. In a practice that's not doing so well, and that includes taking huge sums of money out of the private practice and investing it in another way. And so again, anybody wants to sit and meet with me, meet with Aaron, we'll walk you through them and then make your own decisions at the end of the day. But OSOs are not for everybody, and you have to make the decision for yourself. And like he said, money's just one part of the equation.
Aaron, I think we're actually landing into this final question, which is basically just a question of what's your general advice as people evaluate this. I think my advice always is to consider the wise counsel of as many trusted individuals as you can, and then make the decision with you and your, significant other and God and, everyone. And I think, we can take this ecumenical approach and say, hey, we'll be fine either way or whatever. But I think it is a question of personality type, as I see it. I think there's some personality types that are just not going to be a good fit for a model where you're having to trust, or like, I'll just be honest, Glenn, as you were explaining kind of like the equity and how it was handled and the degree I had to trust it, I don't like that. I mean, like my personality just does not resonate with me. But there's some attractive things to it as well. So I guess to both of you, just to sort of wrap this whole thing up, and thank you to everyone who's hung with us. What's your advice to someone who's evaluating these options? Because there's a professional decision, there's a financial decision. We have focused on the financial decision. I've kind of covered the professional decision, with some previous podcasts, and others have too, but mostly focused on the financial. But what would you say, kind of in a few sentences, to people who are considering this? Aaron, why don't you start, and then I'll let Glenn kind of finish up.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, obviously, you can tell. I mean, your long-term best bet is private practice. But I understand there are different personalities, and sometimes it's hard for me to separate myself and really see it from another point of view. And there are people that don't enjoy private practice, or they're not able to really grow it, that they get the same returns that maybe they could get if they joined an OSO or maybe a sort of a managed type practice. But what I would say to that is, instead of going to an OSO for those solutions, I would say, one, look for and see if it's already within the private practice realm. There's a lot of practices that I think could fill that void in employment and pay you really well. But I also think there's a huge void, again, amongst private practice practitioners for us to be able to fill that void instead of OSOs filling that void. And by that, I mean, for those that are looking at OSOs to save them from whatever they hate about private practice or they dislike about private practice, let's find a way to fill or to provide that opportunity so that the go-to isn't these OSOs. And by doing that, we can keep it all in the family, and we can really just make it to where all doctors do better and keep out, I would say, the outsiders or private equity who I think we deserve it. We need to keep it with us. So that's my take on it. But long-term goals, private practice, and then finding a way to stay within that realm, I think is the best option, obviously.
All right, Glenn, final thoughts?
Yeah, I think Aaron made some great points. I think if you're looking for something that you hate about private practice, do not join an OSO, right? Stay in your private practice, join Aaron's group, use the resources he's got. I don't want you as my partner. I'm being honest. If you hate practice and you don't enjoy it and you're looking for more, the OSO is not going to solve that, right? You need to get your house in order because they're buying you. They're not buying your practice. So if you're Eeyore, you're not going to be a great partner. You need to be Tigger a little bit when it comes down to there, right? And again, at the end of the day, when push comes to shove about your practice, the things one needs to keep in mind is there's much more than just financial about why you're going to partner or not partner with an OSO. It has, right? DJ Quick out of Compton. If it don't make dollars, it don't make sense. So the money has to make sense, but all the other things need to line up as well. And you may end up in private practice. You may end up with an OSO. But remember, if I sell my practice and get that big lump of sum of cash at long-term capital gains of 20% with plus whatever state fees you're going to pay on that, that's going to, from a financial perspective, it's, again, Aaron and I will disagree on this, but it's very hard to beat that. Plus, every penny you're taking home from your practice from this point forward is being paid at your marginal tax or whatever your functional tax rate is over time. Don't discount the long-term play of the money being paid up front at long-term capital gains. So again, I would invite anybody who's interested in looking at the model, really looking at the model, spend some real time with Aaron. I've sat with his calculator. He makes perfect sense. Sit with me. Let's go through my calculator. Let's go through every number. And again, I hope you don't rely on our calculators to make your decision, because if I ask you, what's your production going to be in 4 months, you have no idea. How are we going to run a calculator where we don't know what the Federal Reserve is going to do? We don't know what the markets are going to do. We don't know what our practice is going to do, right? And so make the decision that feels right here in your gut, because it got you through ortho. It got you to buy your practice. It got you to run your practice. Trust your gut, trust your experience. And if your voice says, I don't think I should join an OSO, then don't. Nobody's going to twist your arm for it. And I'm not here to talk you into it. I'm just telling you, this is the biggest financial decision of your life, potentially. Like Kyle said, speak to every person you can, get every number you can. And at the end of the day, listen to this and to this. And if it says private practice, stay in private practice. If it says join an OSO, join the OSO. But I am the last person on the planet who's ever going to say protect the specialty. Because other than orthodontists, nobody on the planet says that. And it's really peculiar to me, 20 years as a restorative dentist, never once heard the word protect the specialty going back to my dad's days. But
because it's not a specialty, right?
No, but
Sorry.
protect. Well, dentistry, you understand where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
But anesthesiologists don't say protect the specialty. So again, I get it. I understand it. I'm not aligned with it, but maybe you are. And if you are, good for you. But make the decision that makes sense up here at the end of the day, because it's guided you the right way so far.
You know what really stinks? We don't have more time. I kind of had a feeling. I had a fear. I won't let fear drive my choice, OSO private practice. But I had a fear that we were going to run low on time. And there were some great things we weren't able to cover. I also lost the ability to share comments outside of Jeannie's excellent comment about my haircut. which was a real bummer. But goodness, if we had shared questions from the audience, I don't even know if we could have finished this thing. So I was tracking the comments. You know, there were some good things there. I was just asked by someone if I had entertained an offer from Smile Doctors. I don't know what the insinuation was, but no, I have not. Um, so anyway, I don't know.
If you
That
say
would have,
anything, people naturally assume that you're in cahoots with,
yeah.
you know,
I don't
big business. I
Ma-
don't get it.
Maybe that wasn't the assumption that was being placed there, but I don't know what the insinuation was. But no, I have not. But hey, I really appreciate Aaron and Glenn coming on and doing this. Was there something they could have done with their last 2 hours and with the days that led up to this? Sure, but I think they did this because I do think they both share a desire to help, and I think they have a desire for truth. And I've seen that in both of them as we've talked through these things. And so obviously they don't agree with one another, and that's okay. But I think that we would both agree that we want people to research this, to not act on fear, and to end up in a decision that is best for them and that resonates best with them. So that's the hope. That's all we got for tonight. We'll do some more maybe later. I don't know. But I do have about 3 minutes of conclusion. So before you shut your laptop or you close your phone, stay with me. I want to thank first OrthoFi and Oliver from OrthoFi specifically. Go download their ebook. It's at startmoresmiles.com/ebook. It really is great and worth your time. Hey, I'm a co-founder at Neon Canvas. I have to make at least one plug. Huge bias alert. I started this company. Go to neoncanvas.com/audit. We will do, in the spirit of auditing your finances, go audit your digital marketing results and see what sort of return on investment we can get for you from a marketing standpoint. That is also a no strings attached conversation. So you have 3 audits you need to do with Aaron, with Glenn Krieger, and with Neon Canvas. Hey, let's make some plugs for a meeting that's coming up, one that I'm very excited about because the fall gets busy, especially for me, who goes to every meeting that exists. But I will be sailing on the OP Summit at sea. It sails out of Tampa and it heads towards Cozumel. And I don't know what it does in between. I guess it just floats. Glenn, can people still sign up? It's September the 18th. Is it too late?
To be honest, I was told there's very few left. I don't mean that. I think we have 1,750 people on the ship right now, and it literally very few. I just told today. So if you want to sign up, great. Go to opsummit2024.com. But yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing you, Kyle. It'll be
Well,
fun.
how will I make it through the buffet in a reasonable amount of
Oh,
time? There's that many
you
people.
don't. You take your time. It's open for hours.
Okay. Relapse is going to play a boat-themed set of music. That's a first on the first night. Glenn and I are going to co-lead some trivia, I believe. I need to work on that. I think I'm also, Neon Canvas is sponsoring a Star Search-themed singing competition on the 80s night. I don't know if you even know about that. I'm very excited about it. I'll be asking that you not sing. I love you, but,
I will not.
all
It's
four
okay.
all 4 Fagula children will be there. It's going to be a blast. Hope to see you there. My next series on TDO Live is going to be on airway orthodontics. It's going to be a debate on this. I was going to do it about a month ago, and I just felt like I wasn't going to cut the mustard with it. And so I've spent some more time to prep for it, to try to get the right groups for the pro airway and for the kind of guarded airway position. And so thank you for your patience on that. If you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts, thanks for doing that. Give me a 5-star review if you don't mind. And go give Glenn one too. He has a podcast and it's excellent. Go subscribe to him. Go subscribe to me and everyone else who does an orthodontic podcast. You probably saw in the lead up to this episode that Neon Canvas is launching a new podcast called The Neon Buzz. It's going to be focused more on orthodontic marketing. I focus mine on really whatever I want to talk about, whatever's interesting, I think, to me and doctors mostly. But that's going to be eminently focused on marketing and growing your practice. It starts September 5th. We have a very talented team that's been working on that. Thankfully, I've had almost nothing to do with it, which is great, but I've been keeping up with it. It looks great. So September 5th, Neon Buzz. And that's really it. So let me just end by saying this. Thank you for spending your Monday night with us. Thank you to Dr. Aaron Swapp and to Dr. Glenn Krieger. Thank you to everyone at OrthoFi. And as always, thank you to Anna, to Alan, to Scott, to Kayla, to Alex, and the TDO team at Neon Canvas. And from all of us here at the Digital Orthodontist Live, I'm Dr. Kyle Fagala, and you better believe I'm signing off. Have a wonderful night. We will see you all very, 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 very soon. Good night.